Thanks, everyone. That was an amazing series of talks. Really delighted with that. And we're kind of moving along in the same sort of vein now. So we're going to be talking about consumer decision making. And we've got a wonderful group of speakers to tell you all about that. We're actually going to start right now with Professor Gareth Harvey from The Hague. Gareth, if you want to get your slides up, we can get started.
If I'm allowed to turn my video on, that would be great.
Oh, okay. I think the host just needs to switch that, and we should have that up and running in a second.
There we go.
There we go. Oh, from inside PowerPoint itself. Fantastic. Yeah, take it away. Excited to hear about this.
Cool. So I'm going to carry on talking and pretty much follow the same sort of theme that we've just been exploring. How can we take the findings that we know from the lab-based studies and apply them in the commercial context? But rather than looking at, shall we say, some of the nice, clean experimental designs you've explored so far, I'm going to look at slightly more, shall we say, some of the messy questions that companies ask. So to start off with, I just thought I'd say who I am. I'm Gareth Harvey. I'm a professor of consumer psychology at HEG in Geneva, and I'm a consumer psychologist. So I'm particularly interested in understanding how environmental cues impact behavior. So if you go around a supermarket and you can't find the eggs, the bacon, whatever it is, it's probably my fault or someone like me. And so I do a lot of work commercially designing supermarket store layouts. So trying to design them in terms of where the products are, how wide the aisle should be, how tall the shelving should be, the music that's playing, all of those sort of factors, hopefully I've considered from a psychological perspective. So rather than doing academic research in terms of publishing papers, I work with companies and do commercial research. So as well as teaching at a university, I do that commercially, and I'm the scientific advisor for the UK's oldest independent design agency. And again, my role is to take principles of psychology and try and use it to make packaging more effective, or to put it basically, help companies make more money. And the way it should work is a company will approach me and normally they'll give me a brief. Now, unlike the questions that you heard before, like which color should we use for our packaging or for our logo, the questions I typically get are a lot more, let's say, blurry. So for example, it's a case of a company will come to me and say, we want people to spend more money in the aisles, or we want them to spend more time. Develop an intervention on how we can do that. Now, if you're interested in behavioral science, you'll be aware that over the last, 15 years, there's been a massive interest. Books such as Predictably Irrational, Nudge, Influence, The Choice Factory, they've all been published and lots of people are really interested by them. But they're pretty much all saying exactly the same sort of factors. So they're all talking about the same interventions. What I've been asked to do by companies is see, how can I find other things from the consumer psychology literature and how can we apply them to develop novel interventions and hopefully give my clients a competitive advantage? So a typical brief I had, which I was working on earlier on a couple of months ago, client was saying, right, we want people to spend more time in the supermarket. So traditional bricks and mortar store. And most people think consumers walk up and down every aisle. Well, we've got lots of tracking data that says that's just not the case. Most people, the way they walk is, we use what's called a race course analogy. You walk around the outside, and then you basically just dive down the aisle, grab what you need, and go back to the safety of the race course, the outside, the perimeter. And what we typically find is that we're trying to find ways to encourage people to go down. Now, we know from environmental psychology, people like feeling in control. So if you've got an aisle and it's quite narrow, people are less likely to go down it. And if they do, they spend less time there. So it's all about trying to find ways to make it feel more spacious. So that's why supermarkets have really high ceilings. It's why the aisles are as wide as we can possibly make them. It's why the shelving in an ideal world should never be taller than you. You should always be able to see over it. But one of my clients said, well, we can't make those changes. We're kind of fixed. We need a set number of aisles. Is there anything else we could do? So we came up with this idea of, well, could we make the shelving sloping? So it's kind of sloping away from you. So at least it gives you the illusion that there's more space in the aisle. So we came up with this concept and we thought, well, that should work. Let's test it. Now, before we roll it out to test it in a supermarket, well, that's going to get very expensive. And if it doesn't work, we look foolish. Now, you may say, okay, if it doesn't work, you've learned something. You've learned that you have an unhappy client and you've possibly lost a lot of money. So we try and minimize the chances things don't work. And the way we start off with that is we test it out, first of all, in a lab-based study. So the first process was we start off, we create a fake shopping environment in a lab, and we test it in there. It took us 4 or 5 iterations to work out how much the shelving needed to slope before it worked in the lab-based study. Once we were happy we kind of got the effect working in the lab-based study, we then rolled it out into a supermarket. And we were actually able to test it out in one supermarket in the northeast of England. So we totally redesigned that store with all of these shelvings, got it working, and we were able to see that people were spending approximately 15% more in the aisles when this sort of redesign was in place. 15% more in the aisles, and again, there was a corresponding increase in the amount of money that people were spending. So that was great, it worked. But it's only been shown to work in one store. So once we did that, it was then tested out, and it was actually rolled out across every supermarket of this one brand across Cape Town, South Africa, starting off in Cape Town. You'll be glad to know that the company who's paying for this research, they paid for me to travel from Geneva to the northeast of England to do the research or design it. They didn't pay for me to go to South Africa to run the study, but that's the way the research typically works. That's the way it should go. But the important thing to highlight here is, yes, we start off in the lab, but we have to actually replicate it in the real world. The lab has so many different problems or challenges that we need to cover. The lack of ecological validity is one. And far too often, psychologists or designers, if I'm working with them, they'll overlook some really basic things. So eye tracking is at the heart of a lot of product design. Far too many designers, they'll do a great eye tracking design. Look at breakfast cereal, a category I work with quite a lot. They'll do an eye tracking study and they'll be looking at something like that. Sorry, pointing on a green screen is quite hard. It works, they'll get some nice results, but the results will rarely generalize to the commercial setting. Well, why? Because in a lab, when we're shopping, we don't just see one product. You'll see, for a start, we'll see a wall of products. So a wall of Weetabix. Think about the impact of one Cadbury's Dairy Milk bar has. It's kind of minimal, it's not going to impact you. What happens when you see a wall of Cadbury's Purple, lots of dairy milk or twirl bars? Actually, it's going to attract your attention in a very different way. You're not able to see the sides of the packaging. It changes how we perceive them. And most lab-based studies, fairly basic flaw, but they don't consider it. But even if we test them with these walls, it's not enough. People behave very differently in a supermarket because, well, let's be honest, there's a huge amount of noise out there. You've got a wall of all the Weetabix, but you've also got the own brand ones, you've got other cereal competing for your attention, and you've got lots of people walking past. You might be shopping with a child who's screaming, wanting attention. There might be another couple having an argument, and you're trying to pay attention and work out what they're arguing about. You're not paying the same conscious attention to the cereal as if you were in a lab-based setting when a nice researcher says, look at this packaging for a couple of minutes. What grabs your attention, or however they phrase it? When you're shopping, you might only look at the Weetabix for a couple of seconds. So they're really different paradigms. So we need to understand that a lab-based study is a very different beast to how we test things in the field. So as I said, my role is to take these findings and apply them into the commercial setting. And I'm trying to find different things in the psychology literature, so the published research that actually shows things that are a bit different. But what's really interesting is most of the papers that are published don't replicate in the commercial setting. And there's some really simple reasons why. First of all, the settings that they use, or the designs they use really complicated statistics. And yes, they can find an effect, but a lot of the consumer site research, they'll be using structural equation modeling, multiple regressions. So they can show that, say, factor X equals consumer purchasing, but only when they mediate out for personality, age, and income levels. So we do lots of complex stats to mediate all out of those variables. That noise, we get rid of it, and we show a nice effect. Well, when I'm designing an intervention for companies, I can't control for all those sort of variables. They're part of the data I have to work with. So a really simple experimental design that doesn't use those complicated stats have a much better chance of working in the field. Likewise, in lab-based studies, they control for all sorts of noise. It's a really simple environment. So the only studies that are likely to replicate into the commercial sectors are ones with a really large effect size. And this is something that we really need to pay attention to. So don't get too worried about your p-values. The effect size is probably one of the bigger things to focus on. And actually companies, they may totally ignore the p-value, but they're more concerned about trying to understand what's the sampling error in your research. If we say X has an effect, well, how confident are we in that? So from the business domain, we're going to be looking at it. And some of those things we're just going to be focusing on is trying to work out, well, okay, let's have a look and say, it may work, but can we take it to the commercial environment? First of all, from a feasibility point of view, does it transfer over? Secondly, we could do something if we had enough money. So we need to think about what's financially viable. There are some great things. We can do a lot more on the online environment. So we can segment based on personality, based on how you look. In a bricks and mortar store, we don't have those sort of criteria. So life gets a lot more complicated when we try to replicate some of these factors in that commercial sector. So it's just trying to think very carefully which studies we could go for. But testing in the commercial sector has some really, really interesting complications that we need to be aware of. First of all, we can do a study that is 100% legal. We have ethical approval from a university or your commercial ethics board, but public perception is very different. A couple of years ago, Daily Mail ran a big campaign talking about secretly filmed while you shop. Some of customers' biggest stores are secretly tracking you. It was on the 6 o'clock news. It was on the 10 o'clock news. Research I was conducting, I was on page 3 of the Daily Mail labeled as Dr. Evil. Everything we did was fully GDPR compliant, but the public perception, there's a big uproar about it. Again, there's a lot more attention to certain things about Cambridge Analytica, manipulation. So we need to think very carefully about these sort of things. You need to be comfortable when you do these sort of things, actually, what are the implications? Now, when these sort of headlines came up, commercially, it made a big difference. I had a very interesting meeting with the Vice Chancellor of my university, trying to explain why I was called Dr. Evil by the Daily Mail. Probably one of my favorite headlines about me ever. But we need to be aware of them and think about the negative implication of doing these sort of research. Commercial research, again, the timeframes and what companies are expecting is totally different. So if I do research, a good example, I did an fMRI project a couple of years ago. The point where the university gave us ethical approval to run the study, the client who was paying for this expected the full project to be completed. They were expecting the project to go from commissioning to delivery within about 4 weeks. They didn't care about paper, that was irrelevant. They wanted a one-page summary and they just wanted an oral presentation of the results. That's all they needed to make a decision. So it's trying to think about some of them. So there's slight differences there. The other thing is, when you're working with these companies, actually try to work out how you get access to the data can be tricky. You may be being paid by a large supermarket or a major brand. They want you to make sure you develop an intervention that will increase sales. But they won't give you the sales data to validate whether you're right or wrong. It's commercially sensitive. So there's some really big issues around those sort of things. So actually, how can you come up with a proxy to see what increases sales? How do you get access to certain data? It's challenging. And running field trials, noise is part of that response. These random events make life fun. So for example, once I was running a project collecting data in Liverpool. A whole day's filming in the store costing multiple tens of thousands of pounds, so well over 30,000. I'm not the biggest football fan. Liverpool were playing in the FA Cup. Consequently, for that day, we had hardly any people in store. It was a totally different sort of environment, and it made a difference in how people attended. That whole day's worth of filming was wiped out because I failed to check the football schedule. Things like when it's extreme weather, heat or rain, it changes where people go to the store. And you can't just generalize if you're collecting data from a one day. So we need to think more about it. And actually replication is so key in this commercial research. If you think about how we started off doing the research, I was saying lab-based study, one store in the northeast of England, and then we replicated in South Africa. Well, if you're working for a brand, how many stores are you going to test in? Are you going to be testing across multiple formats? How many different geographic regions are you going to test in before you're confident in your results? Because we do get a large amount of variations. And it's trying to think, okay, what are we going to accept? How much variation can you accept? What are the cost implications? and the timeframes to deliver. So there are some unique challenges. But for me, it's one of the most exciting things to do. But there are certain things that we really need to consider before you take, or if you are going to work commercially. You can get the great ideas, but the things are, you'll probably never get any papers with doing this sort of research. If a company is paying you to do this research, unless it's going to be part of their publicity stunt, you will have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Why would they want you to publish a paper that their competitors could get that research and they could get it for the price of £30 to buy that one paper when that client has spent £20,000 on this one project? It's a bit of a difference. So it does change how you do research. There's also some really interesting implications over your legal responsibilities when you do commercial work. And it's something as psychologists, we tend not to think about. What did you actually promise the client? Now, you may say, I've got this great idea. It'll be able to increase sales by X%. Now, your contract that you actually sign may not say that. It's just a research proposal. But anything that you say about in your marketing material, or any phone calls, emails about it, they actually can be part of the contract. And legally, you can get into some dodgy grounds if you're not careful. So if you're a behavioral science and you're working commercially, it's a really important idea to actually start to understand what are your legal responsibilities. Things are going to go wrong, and it's something to be aware of. So it's a case of trying to work out, well, what happens if something goes wrong? Are you liable? Is it a case of the university is going to be liable? Or is it your company? And if it's your company, is there a difference between you and your company? Are you the same legal entity? And it's really important to start working out what are those differences, because, yeah, it has some fairly serious implications for you. And the final one to start bearing in mind is, I do commercial research because it's great fun. I also quite like getting paid for it. And actually trying to work out how you pay for or get paid for commercial work, it's a really different sort of ball game. What do you want to get paid for? Is it just based on hours worked? Probably not. We're more likely to be focusing on how much value added do you get to the project. My preferred way of actually trying to get paid is by results. So for example, if I can increase sales by 1% or 2%, whatever, I will get a cut out of that. Now, generally speaking, lawyers and accountants really don't like that, because if we roll it out globally, that can be an awful lot of money very quickly. So normally some accountant steps in and just pays me a flat fee. But it's a great model to start looking at. The challenge is, if you're using it, though, is how can you make sure that you actually trust them? So for example, how do you know that if you've actually been able to increase sales by a certain percentage? So it's a case of, can you get access to that data? Because companies aren't willing to share that data with you most of the time. So it's one of those sort of things to think about. But if you want to take your research, because we've got some great insights in psychology, think about how we can take them out. So that's everything I was just going to quickly mention. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me them personally. My details are somewhere there. And thank you. Hope you found it vaguely interesting.
Oh, absolutely incredibly interesting. Thank you ever so much, Gareth. For everyone in the chat, can you let us know if you found that interesting? Write interesting in the chat. Tell us how you feel about it. If you have questions, put them into the question and answer section. Gareth is going to be able to answer these, while we're here, basically. I think one question that would be really useful for a lot of people here. Would you be able to say something about how, I think a lot of our audience are psychologists, how would they get into the field of consumer psychology? How do they start getting into these kind of jobs?
So I started off actually as part of my PhD. So it was a case of, I approached an advertising agency. I was sort of interested with working with them, and they actually ended up inviting me to a meeting with Robert Cialdini, which was a heck of a great start as a PhD student. And then they introduced me to companies. The problem is there's so many questions companies have, but they don't think of them as psychology-based questions. So it's a case of, actually, you've got knowledge. If it's about what grabs someone's attention, that's great for advertising. How do people learn a message? Well, that's memory. Again, it's all in the domain of psychology. But in a business school, they never get taught it. A marketing manager often doesn't think about it. So there's nothing wrong with actually going out and selling yourself or approaching companies to start doing that. The key is actually thinking about, how can you take what you know and speak in language that's relevant? Because they're not going to want a paper. You're going to have to be able to speak in the language that's relevant, and possibly condense it and make it into a format that they're willing to understand.
I think that's great. I think, Pasquale, if we can get your slides up, and just one final question for, is there a book or a text or a website you could recommend for people who are interested in learning how to do that?
I think probably one of the best places to start off is Richard Shotton's book, The Choice Factory. So it just goes through some of the 24 basic behavioral biases that we use as a starting point. But they're the ones that most people know. Once you know those, what really differentiates you is actually understanding the other things. So that's where we start looking at things such as the Journal of Consumer Psychology, and actually just being aware of what's being published all the time, because there are some really cool things that are happening each year, but they just don't make it into the popular science press.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Gareth. We've got some time after this for a Q&A. And again, if you want to send Gareth some questions, put them into the Q&A box right now. We can try and address these later on. But it's great right now to introduce Pasquale. So we've got Pasquale here from NYU, who's going to talk to us about, the role of financial incentives and nudges in online retail spaces.
Right. I'm on mute. Can you see my slides okay and hear me okay?
You're all good, Pascal.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. Today, my name is Pasquale Rumo. I should start with that. I'm a faculty member at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and a lot of this work is academic based, funded by federal agencies. So I'm going to talk today about promoting healthy food purchases in the context of online retail spaces. I'm going to highlight two different projects, one that is more about economic strategies and one that's more about behavioral nudges and behavioral economic strategies. And before I do that, I will just provide some context for my work. So a lot of this context is based on literature and some statistics from the US, and a lot of it is specifically anchored in healthy eating. So in the US, we know that adults with lower income purchase and consume fewer fruits and vegetables. And conversely, those individuals tend to on average, purchase more sugary drinks than their higher income counterparts, and also purchase more fruit drinks for their children compared to other high income parents. And what's really interesting from a research perspective is that these disparities are actually wider for those who participate in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And so I'll explain what that is because it's specific to the US. And so that is, it's called the SNAP program, and it used to be called food stamps. And it's a federally funded program where if your eligible households could sign up and they get financial benefits to help them buy food. And so ostensibly the goal of the program is to mitigate food insecurity, and there is no explicit goal for healthy eating. And so that's where researchers like myself come in and try to think about ways to leverage this program, since it's federally funded, and to encourage healthier eating, and do that by addressing some of the root causes like food affordability, and also some other nudges that might be more sustainable without sustained funding support for them. So that's where I come in. The angle for a lot of my work is based on how can we affect policy change, and how can something be sustainable and feasible. And so the first study that I'll be talking about is anchored in some of my previous work. I'll just go through this somewhat quickly, but there is work that I've done in the past with the Fair Food Network. They're a nonprofit based out of Michigan in the States, and they are one of the early adopters of this program called the Double Up Food Bucks program. And so it gives consumers $1 for every dollar they spend on fruits and vegetables. So for say you spend $10 on eligible produce, you get $10 back to spend on more of the same eligible produce. And usually that's up to a limit. Like in this context, for this study, they were able to spend $20 per day, or earn an extra $20 per day. And so it's a way to address food affordability and to make produce more affordable for consumers who participate in this SNAP program. So it's only for people who are using their SNAP benefits. And so we partnered with 32 stores in this specific supermarket chain to evaluate the program. The data is from 2015 and 2016, but we published the results recently. And it was great because we had data from stores that didn't have the program, so control stores, and stores that did have the program, our intervention stores, and also data from before the program started and during it. So it was a really strong causal design. And unsurprisingly, we found that the SNAP participants who were enrolled in the program in the intervention stores had higher spending on produce in both years. And so 7% and 2%. And if anyone is curious, I can explain why we think that it decreased in the second year, mostly due to programmatic changes. But these effect sizes are actually kind of smaller than what other people have found. Ours was definitely the largest and also the most real scale. So other researchers have looked at just one supermarket, but this is the first to look at over 30 supermarkets at once. And so we saw this was effective. And we thought, if this is effective in brick and mortar supermarkets, why couldn't it be effective in an online retail setting, which has not happened in any retail store in the US yet. So we also wanted to know, well, if it is effective, is it a question worth asking? And so in the US, over the past 20 years, obviously internet use has skyrocketed just like the rest of the rest of high income countries. And more interestingly, or more relevant for the project, I should say, is that the gap between those high income individuals using it versus low income individuals has narrowed significantly over time. And I don't have a graph for it, but we also know in the past year, due to the pandemic, that online grocery shopping has skyrocketed. And so I'm sure that's a recurrent theme in a lot of these presentations. And that's happened across all income levels, even though it's still lower among low income households. And the online grocery setting is particularly interesting in the US, again, because of the SNAP program. There's a SNAP online purchasing pilot that started now 4 years ago that would allow participants to use their benefits in online transactions. And so this has been really slow in getting off the ground. It just started with Amazon in New York State and has slowly grown over time, but then in the past year has skyrocketed because of calls for equity for allowing people to use their benefits in all contexts and be able to safely acquire food. And so it's not universal yet. We're hoping that it will be universal, but it creates this setting where it's actually possible to study it for these people using their benefits, and the program would be relevant for the people using their benefits. And it's an opportunity to use both economic strategies and also behavioral economic strategies, not only at the point of selection, but also when people are checking out. And so I have a figure here that we constructed for one of our grants. It's a conceptual model of how these nudges might work. And some of you might be familiar with this already, but it basically goes through two pathways. It's both it's tapping into your intuition, so it's providing alternatives. So if you're just going in and shopping and getting what you normally like, it's tapping into that, getting you out of your just normal purchasing behaviors, your way of thinking in system one. And then it's also tapping into your reasoning system by bringing choices to your attention. So it's helping you to think about healthier substitutes, and then hopefully affecting behavior change, like decreasing fruit purchases for children, which is the second study I'll be talking about. And so the type of nudges that I'm most interested in, the next speaker, Dimitris, is a trailblazer in this respect, in terms of testing some of this for saturated fat purchases in the Gorilla platform from Cauldron. But for my two studies, the one option I'm interested in is default option. So this is, for example, placing an item in someone's cart that they would have to opt out of, to opt out of, and it lends an air of authority to tell you that this is a healthier option that we're promoting, and letting people know that it's in their cart and letting them know that they could take it out of their cart. And like I said, it's been effective in reducing, in other contexts, like reducing saturated fat purchases in simulated online stores. And then also offering swaps at point of selection. So several studies have done this already, and mine will not be the first. But this is offering, when you put something in your cart that we think is quote unquote unhealthy, it offers a healthier alternative. And so this has led to decreases in saturated fat, sodium, again, something that Dimitris might get into in his presentation. But we wanted to adopt these for the two areas of interest for me, which at the top like I said, were fruits and vegetables and produce purchases, and also sugary drink purchases. In the first case, this is a study that I applied for a while ago, and I'm actually going to implement in the next month, hopefully. So this will go live soon. But here we're looking at recruiting a couple thousand low-income individuals who have participated in the SNAP program. And we want to characterize their food shopping behaviors and attitudes in a survey, and then send them over to a randomized control trial. And they'll be randomized to 4 specific conditions. And we'll be looking at their fruit and vegetable purchases. And here are those 4 conditions. The first one is just controls. There'll be no intervention. And I'll show you what the store will look like in a second. And the second is a discount, so 50% off of eligible produce. This is not the one-to-one subsidy that I highlighted earlier, but this is actually what consumers, I think, want more, which is just a 50% discount right off of whatever they're putting in their cart, up to a certain amount, $20. And then default cart items. So we'll be preloading their carts with default items. In this specific study, it'll be produce, and then combining them in the 4th condition. So a standard 2x2 design here, where it'll be the 50% discount on the eligible produce, and then the cart preloaded, and those preloaded items will also be discounted. And here is what the store looks like. We're calling it Lola's. This is a store that I helped create to help develop in partnership with my colleagues at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the States. And so Lola's we're hoping to use Lola's to answer several different research questions. My colleagues are using it to look at meat intake, for example. And you can see here that the screenshot here is showing the apple aisle, for example, and all 4 of these Apple products are eligible. You can see the label that I created there. It's a 50% discount eligible label. It tells the consumer that they can do it up to $20, so they understand how it works. And when they enter this store, they'll also see instructions to tell them what's going on, about how this works. And you can see I've preloaded their cart with another apple, and that will be customized in this study to what participants say they purchase most frequently in the survey portion of the study. And then the cart shows that they got the discount, how much the discount is, and how much their total. It shows the subtotal and total. So it's as clear as we can possibly try to make it. And so, like I said, that study will launch this month, hopefully. And then in the second study, this one is newer. This is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation here. And the target here is fruit drinks. So the idea is that fruit drinks, a lot of their marketing techniques are misleading and mislead parents into thinking that they're healthier options. So we think nudges are more appropriate in this context because it's more information-based. And so our goal is to use these nudges to promote healthier beverage purchases and subsequently intake by targeting the parents of these children, specifically those who participate in the SNAP program. Again, this is the running thread of my work. And we're using 2 nudges here, shelf ranking and swaps. So I've discussed swaps already. That will be when parents add a specific fruit drink to their cart, like Capri Sun and other types of things. They'll be offered a healthier swap option. We're actually going to show 2. One is water, and other will be more fruit flavored beverages. And then a whole second tier if they decline those for 100% fruit juice. So a hierarchy of healthfulness. And then shelf ranking will take that same hierarchy of healthfulness of beverages and manipulate in the experimental condition how it looks when people are navigating the aisles themselves, and then also when they're searching for items. So the healthier items will be sorted first. And I think the most novel and interesting part of this project to me is the usability testing and interviews we're doing. So this is my first foray into qualitative research, but we will be recruiting participants in round 1. After round 1 of creating the store is done on the Gorilla platform, we'll be doing this testing and getting feedback from the SNAP participating parents themselves, learn how they shop for groceries in general or how they shop for beverages specifically, and then how they navigate our store and what they might like to see different. And then similarly, we'll be conducting key informant interviews with Fair Food Network, the nonprofit that I talked about with the Double Food Books program earlier in the presentation. getting their feedback, what would be feasible for their retailer partners, and then talking to a retail partner one-on-one. So we have buy-in from at least one retailer right now to talk about whether they would take it on, what we might need to change to make it more feasible. And then in round two, once we incorporate that feedback into our experimental store, we'll be recruiting a few thousand SNAP participating parents into an online RCT, like in the first study, and looking at whether the nudges lead to fewer purchases of fruit drinks. Then a big goal is to disseminate these findings to stakeholders like the retailers and the SNAP community, et cetera. And so those are all my studies. I think the main thing I'd like to highlight with my work is that my emphasis is always on feasibility and sustainability. Feasibility of these nudges, will retailers take them on? We're trying to bake that into the research process itself by adding a qualitative component. And then sustainability, just in general, what are we studying? Is what we're studying something that can be not only feasible, but something that can be more permanent? So something like the Double Up Food Books program, those are usually funded by entrepreneurship and federal funds, but we want something that can be much more permanent and sustainable in terms of for the retailers themselves. So I like to end by acknowledging my mentors who helped me with this on especially the first study, and then my collaborators, especially those at UNC at Chapel Hill, and then my funding mechanisms. And so I'll end there. Thank you. I'll take a question if anybody has them, or wait till the end.
No, Pascal, that was amazing. Thank you ever so much. Thoroughly enjoyed that. But yeah, remember everyone, if you have questions, put them into the question and answer box for us. We're going to be able to get to those probably as we're going through this, but also maybe we've got some time in the Q&A section later. In fact, we've got a question that's just come in right now. Pascal, super interesting, totally agree. What will your basket default option be based on? Just a random healthier product? What if they're looking for veggies or fruit? Or is it based on certain preferences and initial choices as with the swap?
It's a great question. We put a lot of thought into that. It actually was the quote unquote aim one of our research study, was how do we develop these default options? And so because we're looking at a SNAP participants who have participated in the SNAP program, we actually have we use data from the national, it's called NHANES, the National Health Survey in the US. And it has data on the food purchasing and consumption behaviors of a wide swath of Americans, but including those who participate in SNAP. And we're able to go in there and see what the most popular purchases are. So if we're just putting one fruit and one vegetable in the cart, I think I saw another question like to that effect in the chat. And the default will be just the most popular option that we've identified based on household size and some demographics of the participants. But in the survey itself, before they go into the randomized control trial, and this is actually the most challenging part to implement in Gorilla in general, because we want to customize it, is we're letting them choose between 5 fruit options and 5 vegetable options. Which one do you purchase the most often? And so whichever one they select is what will show up in their cart. And so that's the last hurdle for us to get this going.
No, really amazing. I love it. Let's say a big thank you to Pascal in the chat. Everyone say thank you. We're going to hear more from later on, but right now we've got Dimitris Koudakidis, who's here from the University of Oxford, who's also going to be talking to us about healthy decision-making with online shopping. So Dimitris, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jos. Can you see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Right, I am.
Just at the back.
Okay, here we are. So, thank you very much for inviting me. I am Dimitris. I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford, and my research focuses on food purchasing as well as developing interventions for dietary weight loss. And my studies are funded through public funds from the National Institute for Health Research. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how we can improve attitudes to foods through applying behavioral sciences and nudges, particularly focusing on the food purchasing and pretty much following on from Pascal's excellent presentation. So a little bit of context. we know that diet together with tobacco use are the two most important determinants of health. And as in the US, the same applies in the UK, where the diet at the population level is suboptimal as we eat quite a lot of sugars, saturated fats, salt, as well as calories. Now, trying to improve that at the population level has been very, very challenging, and therefore we need novel interventions to try and see how we can actually manage that. In this context, food purchasing is a very promising option because it is a key determinant of food consumption, and therefore that gives us a clear opportunity for an intervention with wide reach. Now, we can simplistically think of these interventions as those that target the individual and those that target the environment. And both speakers have touched upon those. So the individual level interventions, such as offering people a healthier alternative or a swap, require reflection and analytical decision-making. But many of our decisions about food are not reflective, but instead they are automatic reactions prompted by environmental cues. And therefore, there's quite a lot of interest on environmental level interventions, such as altering the default at the point of choice, the so-called choice architecture or nudging interventions. And as Gareth mentioned, it's quite challenging to run these interventions with retailers. So what we did was that we decided to take a step back and try to see if we can see an effect in the lab in an experimental online setting. So the aim of the first study, and I will present two of those today to you, was to test the effectiveness of an individual level intervention and environmental level intervention on the saturated fat content of the shopping basket during an online shopping experiment. So participants were recruited and they were asked to buy 10 items from a shopping list. These were all items that were high in saturated fat and for which alternatives with lower saturated fats were also existing. And we tried to look for food categories that were typical in the UK diet. We asked participants to buy one from each category and nothing more, and try to buy things that they and their family would typically eat. So what we did was that we recruited 1,240 people through Prolific, and we randomized them to either being offered a swap, either altering the default order of foods, both interventions combined, or a control group. In the first intervention, where we offered people a swap, people essentially went to our online supermarket where they could see the instructions, they could withdraw at any point, and they could essentially look for an item as with any other supermarket, either through the drop-down menu or by typing on the bar. So if, for example, somebody wanted a cheddar cheese, they will click on that, they will see all the products in random order, and they will click on the one that they wanted to buy. And at that stage, they will get a swap, which will be matched for brand, weight, and price. And they could choose to either keep this or stick with their original option. So this will be added to the trolley, and then they will continue doing that for the following 10 products, and then they're going to check out. In the second intervention, where we essentially changed the order of products and we ranked them based on the amount of saturated fat that they had, that meant that essentially what participants saw was that the products were in an ascending order of saturated fat. So this time, when people clicked for the cheddar cheese, what you see here is typically half-fat cheeses, lighter cheeses, and in the particular case of, here I am. So in this case, what you see is that participants saw half-fat cheeses and lighter cheeses pretty much in the whole first page. And it was only until the second page that they were actually able to see a real cheddar cheese. They could, as always, click on this and see the nutrition information as with any other supermarket. They could add things to the trolley, go back on the menus, and continue on with the next products. Now, we were a little bit worried that because that was simply an experiment and people weren't actually spending their own money, that what they're going to do is that they're going to rush through this very quickly, click on every single button that they could think of and try to finish as quickly as possible. So we ran a process evaluation and we're really assured to see that people spent about 20 minutes on the study, browsed about 25 pages and bought about 10 products in their basket. So far, so good. Our primary outcome was the change in the percentage energy from saturated fat in the total basket. And compared with the control group that had no intervention and had about 26% of their energy from saturated fat in their final shopping basket, offering a swap reduced that by 2 percentage points, which was statistically significant and what we had powered our study to detect because we thought that this was a clinically relevant reduction. Altering the order reduced that by 5 percentage points, and that was significantly lower both compared to the control and compared to the swaps. And combining the interventions together led to a small decrease further, but this was not significantly lower than altering the order. It was only significantly lower than swaps and the control group. What this tells us essentially is that both interventions were effective. Altering the order was more effective than swaps, and combining the two, essentially, there was no added benefit of adding the swaps. We were also pleased to see that there was no difference in the cost, which is a major challenge for many of these interventions, and there was no significant difference by group in the total shopping basket. And there was also no difference in terms of sex, age, ethnic group, BMI, education, or income. Now, moving on to the second study, of course, offering the swaps was less effective than altering the order, but many supermarkets do see this as a much more viable first step approach. So we wanted to explore a little bit further how we can actually increase the acceptance of swaps. So that was about 10% in the previous study. So although people found them quite acceptable, not a lot of people actually clicked on to accept the swaps. So what we thought was that messaging and framing may affect the choice, and typically giving people vague information on nutrition quality might not be particularly salient. On the other hand, more salient strategies, such as, for example, the PACE, or what we call the physical activity calorie equivalent, which I will explain in the next few slides, may be more effective. So the aim of this study was to test whether incrementally increasing the tangibility of the information provided with lower energy swaps this time. So what we were trying to do was to reduce the amount of calories that people ordered, if this reduced the total energy ordered in an experimental setting. So in this study, we randomized people into 4 groups. The first one was the control group, where people got their standard swap with no particular messaging, simply saying, how about swapping your standard Coke to a Coke Zero? In the second group that had the fewer calories message, there was a badge saying that this has fewer calories. In the third group, which was the numeric calorie group, we're essentially giving the exact number of calories that people saved by making this swap. And in the final physical activity calorie equivalent group, we were giving the exact number of calories and how many minutes of walking this equates to. So in this particular case, saving 208 calories, and that equates to about 46 minutes of walking. What we found was that in terms of sweet snacks, both the numeric calories and the PACE messaging were significantly reduced the energy content of the shopping baskets for sweet snacks. For savory snacks, which were typically crisps, we saw that all interventions were substantially reduced the energy content of the shopping basket compared to the control. However, we didn't see any effect on drinks, although there was a small trend that the pace messaging might be a little bit more effective. Now, these don't look like huge changes because the control, if you look at the sweet snacks, that starts from 215 calories on average and goes down to 200 calories. But because these are only very small items, the length that we have to go through to offer an alternative that can be viable is the margin is very small. So within this context, and if this is replicated with multiple snacks throughout the week, we would be able to get a clinically meaningful difference in energy intake. So what are the implications? So of course, for research, these are experimental trials, and we do need to test the strategies in real online settings, as well as study the long-term effect on food purchasing habits. But until this time comes, online supermarkets can definitely play a much more proactive role in shaping healthier choices for their customers by knowing that both offering swaps, but also altering the order of products to prioritize the products that are more healthy can actually be very effective. So in summary, interventions to change the food purchasing are promising to nudge people into healthier choices. Altering the order and altering the environment is more effective than swaps. Increasing the tangibility of the information providing when offering a swap, it increases the effectiveness of the swap. And within this context, the physical activity calorie messaging is the most effective. I would like to thank my colleagues and collaborators, both at the University of Oxford and at UCL, and particularly Dr. Carmen Piernas, Professor Susan Jebb, and Sarah Brithnach, and our funders, and thank you for your attention.
Amazing, Dimitris. Thank you ever so much for that. Absolutely fantastic. We've got one question in the Q&A. Remember, if you've got more questions, feel free to put them in. There's one question here, basically just asking you to describe the control group a little bit more, if you can.
Sure. So essentially in the control group, what happened was that we didn't give any intervention at all. So participants saw all products in the random order that they were to see them in the supermarket. So there was actually no influence from us on the way that the products were ranked, and it was simply a random.
Really great. And actually, if I can get Gareth and Pascal to turn on their videos as well, and we can start having the panel discussion. There's one more just for you, Dimitris, from Laura, just asking about whether there were any kind of thresholding for offering the swap, which is quite an interesting point, because you could imagine that, you know, if somebody's doing the shopping, if they're shopping for a family with children versus, are they a sporty, athletic individual or not? Are they an obese individual?
So we had to make sure that the swaps that we offered were substantially lower in saturated fat, as well as in calories in the second one. And the point from that was that we didn't want to have a swap that would be only 1, 2, 3, or 5 calories lower, because that wouldn't necessarily make any difference to the overall energy, and it would probably just people wouldn't really enjoy it that much because they have already wanted the other product. So there was a 2% reduction in the saturated fat in the first study, and we also wanted to make sure that the price and the quantity of the product was very similar to the one that they ordered. So we wanted to make sure that the amount and the price would be as close possible as the original product, and there are specific details of that on the paper.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And I think if we can get that link to that paper into the chat, that would be fantastic. Okay, we've got one question coming in for all the panelists. Academic researchers tend to work on encouraging healthier choices, and commercial researchers on selling more, increasing profits. Do these goals cancel each other out? What do each of you think? I think we start with Gareth. I think we start with your opinion on the matter.
So it's a really challenging one. And actually, there's a great quote from Rory Sutherland about what is advertising. And the line is, I'd rather be thought of as unethical than ineffective. And I think it kind of sums up a lot of what we do. If you do commercial work, you have some really hard choice about what you are prepared to do and what you're not going to be prepared to do. And you have to make some personal decisions on what projects you're prepared to work on and what you're not going to work for. I kind of use the line that in normal use, will this product cause harm? And that's where I draw the line on what I'm prepared to work on and where I'm not going to work for. So, for example, cigarettes, I would never work for. Likewise, when it comes to some of the military ones where I've been asked before, I've always turned those research down. But it's a really tough one on working out where you're prepared to work for. And if you are solely a commercial researcher, it's very easy for me to turn research down. I've got an academic salary coming in. It might be a bit harder if this was my only livelihood and I hadn't got a big project on the go.
Great. And I think, Pascal, what do you think, especially thinking about your interventions as well and literally putting things into people's baskets, saying this is what you should be buying?
Right. Yeah, it's a controversial approach to some people, potentially too paternalistic to some, of course. I think it depends on the product and it depends on the retailer. So I think they can cancel each other out, but sometimes they can complement each other or sometimes they're not a problem. So I can think of two examples. Produce, I think, is something that in some of my anecdotal conversations with retailers is something they want to promote. And we've seen, for example, with the Double Up Food Bucks program in brick and mortar stores, that it was a popular option. People liked it. The only thing they didn't like was they wanted nothing to do with, training clerks to tell people how the program worked. Any extra costs they were averse to, but they were okay with the idea that people would be spending more money on produce and buying more produce because that's a high profit margin for them. But that might not be true for sugary drinks, for example. That's an area where it might cancel out. Those are companies that pay a premium to get their products featured. And my swap options, for example, would be undermining that specifically. So I acknowledge that as a limitation. And then as far as retailers go, I'm talking to a food cooperative in the US who has their mission statement is to promote health and equity in their community. So I think that they're okay with some of those trade-offs, but that's not true for the big retailers like Amazon and Walmart.
And I guess, Dimitris, does that kind of follow suit with the UK?
Yeah, I think pretty much. I think, yeah, they have covered it all. It is a very big challenge to try to reduce the energy, but also increase sales, because to an extent, by reducing sales, you are achieving a reduction in energy intake, which to an extent it would be quite a useful thing from managing the overweight and obesity problem that we have. However, I think there are a lot of specific categories of products that we can definitely target, and there is definitely a very good opportunity there to make sure that we can balance the two in a good way.
I think the one thing I'd add is we have to be careful that we take the big picture effect, because if we're not careful, we look at the effects of just saying sugary drinks, but we need to consider the whole shopping basket experience in store. So like the classic example, people always say about, oh yes, supermarkets, they pump the smell of fresh bread to make you buy more. Actually, they don't do that. The fresh bread smell makes you buy more baked goods, but baked goods have a really low profit margin. So although you buy more baked goods, the big bulky items, you look in your trolley and you think, oh gosh, I've bought a lot today. I'll stop shopping earlier. So actually, they end up buying more items with a low profit margin and less of the expensive ones. And if we're not careful with some of these interventions, we're focusing on just the effect on one niche variable, and we need to see a broader picture here to see what's really happening.
I think actually that kind of raises my kind of next question.
I think that's a very good point, and especially what we saw, for example, in our study was that we substantially reduced the amount of saturated fat. There was no impact on cost, but when we looked at the different types of different other markers of nutrition quality, so calories, salt, and sugar, we saw that calories went down, salt was unaffected, and sugar actually went up. And the reason for that was that in order for us to give swaps that were lower in saturated fat and they were based in the dessert aisle, we had to go up in sugar. However, the increase in the sugar was very small compared to the huge reduction in calories. So all in all, I think the net effect is there to be self-positive, but that's why, for example, such an intervention to reduce saturated fat might actually work much better with only meat or milk or products where you don't have this kind of trade-off. So that's a good point.
Thank you. I want to just kind of finish this up now just with one last question. Obviously, with the BeOnline conference, and a lot of this work has been done in online shopping. And I'm curious to get your opinion to what extent these nudges will actually translate into real world shops. And if we start this time the opposite way around, so Dimitris, we start with you, please.
Yeah, so my team has been doing quite a lot of work with some retailers, not online, but on real supermarkets. And it seems that some of these nudges do work for specific products and specific aisles, but not with others. So it is always about looking at the very specific product. For example, with breakfast, it might work, for example, with breakfast cereals, but not work with vegan sausages, that sort of thing. So you perhaps need to find the right intervention for the right product. And I think I would definitely be very interested to speak with Pascal and think about the swaps and the interventions that he's thinking of. Yeah.
I think I'm next, right? If we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would love. First of all, would love to talk more about this. Yes. Yeah, I think again it depends. I think this is what Dimitris was saying. I think it depends on the product. I think the chances of something like the 50% discount being offered in online retail spaces is very high. The swap options for sugary drinks are very low, most likely. I mean, that's why we wanted to build in I said this during my presentation, but the emphasis is on getting feedback from the retailers themselves to at least make it, to increase those chances, even if they are very low. I think, my brain just blinked. I had a point to say. I'll stop there. I blinked. Sorry.
All right, if it comes back to you, we can jump back to you. Yeah, Gareth.
The one thing I'd say is it's worth remembering that while some of them will translate, online we have so many more opportunities and we can do things that we could just never do. So online we can segment in a way that we just couldn't do. When I design a supermarket, it's got to be as effective as possible to target as broad a demographic as possible. Online, we develop different websites for different personality types, different ages, based on your previous shopping experience. So we can target in a way that's just not a possibility in a bricks and mortar store. So some things won't translate, but it opens up so many more possibilities that actually it's so much easier to nudge people online. So commercially, it opens up so many doors.
Yeah, the thing I was going to say is that the other thing to consider is whether these interventions are feasible in and of themselves, and also whether they should be targeting individuals. I think that's a big question. So a lot of my work, like I said, is based on the SNAP program, the AKA food stamps program in the US. And that's because we're targeting food affordability in the first program, but it might not be ethical to only implement this intervention for a specific target audience. I think that's just something for all of us to consider.
No, I think that's a great point. I think there is a whole separate ethical discussion to have about consumer nudging in general, I think. But I think we're going to avoid that. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Gareth, Pascal, Dimitris. This has been amazing. I think we actually need to touch up on this again, because I think there's still so much more to talk about in this. Please, everyone in the chat, tell our speakers how much you enjoyed that. Say thank you very much. What we're going to do now is actually Nick, our CTO, is going to join us, and he's going to be giving us a demonstration of Shop Builder, which a couple of you guys were showing in your talks, which is great. So Nick, if you're ready, we can get your slides up and see this amazing tool in action.